how to sort out your S-curve issues, and also the do's and don'ts on building a helix. Hi, welcome back to Chadwick Model Railway. I'm Charlie. Now in this video I will be building another helix, although clearly I'm not going to film the whole thing because I've done that in videos number 114 and 115, and should you be contemplating taking on such a beast, then that's perhaps where you ought to start. But before I kick off with the building of the helix, there's a couple of things I need to run through. Obviously there's the lessons learned from building the first one, and also the dreaded S-curve. Well, what do I mean by that? Oh, and it's also worth mentioning that since the last video I have put a teak stain on the top of this baseboard because the brightness of the pot ply was actually burning out in the camera, so that's why it's changed colour. Right, here are 4 pieces of third radius set track curve, and as you can see they change direction, and this is known as an S-curve. Now if your train comes along here and down the other way, there becomes a problem here as they change direction, especially if the back of the train is heavier than the wagons at the front of the train. And this happens just as much in the real world as it does in model railways. Clearly in the real world it doesn't happen that often because the real world seems to know more about trains than we do, and quite rightly so. So if that's such an issue with model railways, how would we get around it? Well, the answer is reasonably simple, and that is if you break your S-curve and you insert a piece of track that is the same length or longer, such as that, as your longest wagon or coach, and this happens to be my longest, which is a Mark III coach, then the problem disappears. Of course, if the S-curve is very gradual, then perhaps this isn't required. But if you're having derailment issues for no apparent reason and you have an S-curve, this might just be your problem. Now here on the old helix, you can see the curve coming off the top of the helix straightens up over sort of like a bridge affair before it makes the climb up towards the viaduct. And the straight sections here remove the S-curve. It's also worth mentioning that the tighter the S-curve, the worse the problem becomes. So if you're using first radius curves, you could be in for a good hiding. Right, but how does all this stuff affect Chadwick? Well, hopefully you watched a video a couple of weeks ago where I installed this point in this position and all seemed well until my track planning expert, a lovely gentleman by the name of Lee, he got on to me and said, actually Charlie, you've missed a bit because you haven't installed or put into place the helix support structures, because this line here, which should go into the helix as the upline being on the outside, because the upline is the outside track is obviously longer than the inside track, which means that the outside track is actually going to be less steep, as it were. So the inside is always the run down. So how would this go? Well, it would go something like this. And as you can see, that is completely unacceptable with a very harsh S-curve. So Lee said, yep, put it back to where I planned it, and like a good little modeler I did, which then puts the S-curve now sort of far less severe into that area there, although the S-curve clearly does still exist. Now another friend of mine, yes I have more than one friend, came around the other day and said, Charlie, I've been thinking about it and if you were to move that point back to here, there is an alternative, and that is, as obvious as the nose on your face, just re-rig it on the outside of the helix assembly, but make sure it's at the right level, and therefore there is next to no S-curve and all should be well. And I thank him profusely. So going against Lee's advice, I have moved it back. But where does that leave us with the downline? Well, now the downline, because the upline isn't this area, the downline can kind of move along this area where it needs to be. And if I just sort of poke that into place and pop that onto there, then the S-curve sort of comes back, but in this area here it's reasonably straight. which takes me on to an extremely interesting development. Because if it's straight, you can install a re-railer. A re-railer, I hear you ask? What's one of those? Now, a gentleman who subscribes to the channel has sent me this image and asked me not to reveal his identity. It's a 5-lane helix of first, second, third and fourth and flexi-track on the outside to build this monster helix. It's capable of holding 40 trains. I'd hate to think of the weight of it, I must confess. Now, hopefully you can see here that there are these plastic sort of constructions. Now, these are re-railers, and I believe they're made by Hornby and Pico. So what does a re-railer do? Well, should you have a train that's sort of thrown the odd bogey and you run it over a re-railer, it ought to pop it back on the tracks. And if your helix is somewhat problematic, this could clearly be a lifesaver. I'd like to think that trains going onto the helix would not have any derailing issues, but coming off the helix you certainly could have, should your track laying be, let's say, somewhat substandard. But it's a hell of a construction, and I'm very grateful to him sending me this image so I can pass on this tip. Now, what is this particular helix made of, you might ask? Well, this is M8 rod, and there are 16 pieces of rod to give you the verticals and tons of washers and nuts. The bed of the track is made of 6mm pop ply, and as I showed you earlier, there is a support structure and which goes underneath, and then these two locating pieces go either side, and you glue this section here to here and you get the rigidity, and obviously once you bolt it all together you get a reasonably rigid structure. However, James, where I got this from at DCC Train Automation, recommends that you don't actually do the nuts that tight, because you know it's a kind of a moving object, and if you sort of get a bit of a slant you can always pull it back, and then when it's finished and complete you can just tighten up the bolts. So let's have a look at it all laid out. And here it is all in place with the spacers in the right positions. So all I need to do now is either drill straight through those holes into the baseboard or mark them and then drill them through, and as you can imagine then in go the M8 bolts. All straightforward, and as you can imagine, as you sort of build one layer, obviously it comes up over that side, you then stop and lay the track, because obviously you can't put the next layer because you'd never get to the track. So I should just drill those holes out and take it from there. Now the section pieces that I use are a little bit different, because I've coated them with 5mm foam, and this stuff is available from Wix, and hopefully you can see here the name of the product I've used. I'm not necessarily going to recommend this because it does damage quite easily. It does sort of dent and score, but at the end of the day it's in my fiddle yard area on my helix, so it shouldn't really matter. It's not a good idea really to poke it with a soldering iron either. I found that out to my detriment, but you know it does damage easily, but at least it keeps the noise down from the trains on your helix. And this piece, and the second arrangement goes on a pair of M8 nuts, and then this will go in here then, and you'll start to see the slope take shape, except this piece here has to come around here for some arrangement onto the first track, but normally it just off it goes and on its sweet merry way. Now I did want to touch on the problems from the last build. The feeds to the track there's going to be 2 feeds per loop, one kind of equidistant, let's say, but you are relying a great deal on the conductivity of fish plates. That isn't necessarily such a good idea, but I'm going to use brand new radius 3 and radius 4 track with new fish plates. Now should you be using older track or flex track, please bin the fish plates and get new ones, because you're going to rely on 100% on the conductivity between those fish plates, so they are crucial. What else? Let me just run through these. Block detection. Each single loop will be a block. There'll be no stop mark. So I'm going to assume that Train Controller, or if you're into iTrain or JMRI and all that sort of blah, that it will stop it prior to getting to the next track. It's just a case of programming and doesn't concern the majority of people watching. We're in the middle of a heat wave here in the UK at the moment. Normally just pours in rain, to be honest. But now is a wonderful time, if you're an attic or a shed modeler, to go and lay track, because the track will have expanded. So rather than do it in the winter and then come back in the summer and find your track's ripped itself out of the ballast, now's the time to do it. It's just one of those odd things, really, because I get people asking me for advice on, you know, what should I do about track expansion if my layout is in an attic. And short of putting air conditioning and Velux windows and all this sort of blah, lay your track in the hot weather. I mean, you can even turn heaters on, can't you, and warm the room right through before you lay track. If you're thinking of buying a Helix, or not building, but buying or building or whatever a Helix, all well and good. The price of the Helix isn't that expensive. It's the price of the track. So please do your homework first. And if you're going to build a Helix, then perhaps you can go to swap meets and everything else and buy decent quality used track or new track, because that's the money pit. It's the track that's most expensive. Routing the cables. Before, I mentioned there's 2 feeds to every section of track, and before I had them coming up in the middle of the bars. This time I'm going to route the cables down the vertical bars. It makes them much more secure and sensible idea, really. I have a digital spirit level, which I'll show you later, and if you need one, there'll be a link in the Show More tab. I'll make a jig later on, I'll show you that bit. Test each level as you go. So once you've put the level in, you know, you can always run a train up it to make sure it works, and you'll get good connectivity from the start. And of course, before you lay the second layer, it's got to be absolutely perfect, because you're never going to get to that layer again. So you've got to test the track prior to putting another set of boards on top. We'll talk in a bit about calculating the number of turns and the height between boards. We'll come to that in a moment. Power districts. Should you have separate power districts for your inner and outer? Well, I thought that'd be a jolly good idea. And then it occurred to me, no, it's not such an idea, because if I have a major derailment on the inside track, let's say, and it shorts out, I really don't want the outside of the Helix tracks to be running. So I would put it all on one power district. So if there's a short on one track, it will cut the other tracks at the same time. USB screwdriver, track joints from bar joints, yep, no power base. Oh yeah, I used a power base on the first layout because I had some struggling steam locos, which I've sorted out with magnets and putting more weight in them. And if I'm going to put the steamers up a Helix, it's going to be the Helix 1, not this one, not Helix 2. I'm not going to put a power base in, because the ones that struggle can struggle on the old Helix with the assistance of the DCC Concepts power base, and I'm not installing them here. And that's about it. Right, so I shall, and clearly the cable sizes for the droppers will be 1602 red and black. So I've got a great deal of soldering to do, so that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. Getting on for 40 bits of soldering to do for the wire. So I shall come back to you in a bit when I've made a bit more progress. Now, as I'm making up these assemblies, it's worth mentioning how we construct them. Well, it's quite straightforward, really. I showed you the pieces before. There's the alignment segments marked inside and outside, so we know which way those goes. There's the bridging piece in the middle, and they're held together with a nut and a washer. On the underside, you have a washer and a nut to keep this in the right place, but the other nut and washer are to give you the right height above the baseboard, and then these two go straight through 2 of the holes that are drilled in the baseboard, and a washer and a nut underneath, so it will kind of just sit like that. And of course, when we do the calculations to make sure they're at the right height and the amount of climb is correct, we adjust these to fit. So that takes us on to how do we know what height we're after? Let's go to the computer. Well, here we are in a program called AnyRail, which is only available on PC, doesn't work on fruit-based computer systems. Now I've already changed this position of this point here, as you recall. It's now kind of up this way a little bit, and this track here actually bypasses this platform and goes straight and joins it kind of in. It hits this platform here. Okay. Now I've worked out that we need 4.5 turns on the helix, and we end up here, and then we come off the top of the helix on these tracks here. And if I switch the views around and hide the storage and bring in the scenic level, I know it's confusing, then we come off the helix here and we rise up again up into the riverboard, which is over here. What's crucial here is as the helix climbs that we don't climb too high, otherwise it'd be very difficult to build the TMD area on a baseboard above the top of the helix. So this final height here is absolutely crucial. So the calculations between when we start the helix and when we finish the helix are absolutely crucial. Now, Lee, the track planner, has made this exceptionally easy for us. So with 4.75 turns, i.e. 4 3/4 turns on the helix, it should do us just fine. Now the details he's put in this marvellous spreadsheet is the height of the helix at the bottom of the floor, from the floor to the bottom of the helix is 17.75 inches. It actually allows for an extra 1/4 of an inch for the board that you can see here as it starts its progress. The target height is 33.75, i.e. 33 3/4 inches, and that's where we want to finish up here, 33 3/4 inches. Now this self-populates, so if you put in the amount of turns you require and the heights you require, then all this data is filled in. If I were to put in, instead of 4.75, if I was to put in 5.75, you'll see the whole spreadsheet changes. But the height at each turn is only gone up 2.78 inches, and my locos, the tallest locos, are 3 inches, which is the top of the chimneys of a King George V. So clearly 5.75 turns isn't going to work, so we want 4.75. Whoops, that's 45, bit of a giveaway there, wasn't it? Right, so it's now over 3 inches, so I know my King George V will fit. Right, so there are 38 sections, and we go from the third radius curve, i.e. going down, we go down in 1 in 37 and we come up at 1 in 42. So it's worth keeping an eye on these parameters to make sure that your locos and trains are capable of doing it. The gradient is 2.3% on the way up and 2.6 on the way down. It's steeper on the way down because it's on a third radius track as opposed to the fourth radius track, and hopefully that all makes sense. If we go back to the AnyRail plan now, so we come on to the helix here, we do 4.75 turns and we come off here, and then we rise from here to the final board by a distance of, we've got 1.75, 1 3/4 inches to go to get to the final height, which is joining back up with the river board. This is invaluable, this spreadsheet, should you wish to design a helix, and if you're a patron and you want a copy of it, just email me and I'll send it out. If you're not a patron, you will find a link to it at the foot of the Show More tab. Click the link and it should take you to this page where you can download it from my Google page. It should work without my permission. If it doesn't work without my permission, I will go in and change the permissions, but there's no real way of knowing until after I release the video. But that's how it all works. It's a marvel. So now, with most of the first circuit in place, it's time to glue them down and obviously add some clamps. Now, the wood glue I'm using for this is Gorilla Glue, and I would not use anything else. Now things have moved on and I'm into the track laying stage. As you can see, this is the downline. The downline now has the re-railer installed, and I've actually screwed the inner circuit down, which I'll show you that in a second on the outer circuit. Here's the outer circuit. The point runs up there and joins the rest of the track. But I thought it would be useful if I showed you how I solder in these droppers, because I do it in a little bit of a different way. And because I don't want the droppers to come through the boards of the Helix, I need them to come out onto the side. So hence I've cut a couple of the sleeper bits of webbing away and soldered the cables so they will come out between the sleepers and then down the side of the support rod and then through the board and away to join up with the rest of the electrics. Now, I mentioned that the inner track had already been secured, so I'm just about to do the outside track. But it's noteworthy to show you that the joins in the track coincide with the joins in the boards, and that's crucial so you get the right positioning of your rails on the boards, because if they overlap then you're either going in too close or too far away from where you ought to be. Now, the screws I've used are these ones here. Now, whether you can get these online or not, I really don't know, but I bought them from a hardware shop in Yeovil. But the great thing about them is that when you screw them into the track, they bridge across two sleepers and therefore keep it nice and secure. But there's one other further advantage, and that is if you change your mind and you need to move them, then clearly with the next deck here you can't get in, but with one of these small right angle screwdrivers you can actually undo them, take them up, try and reposition them. But because it's not nailed down or screwed down with a longer screw that needs a longer screwdriver, then one of these little right angle screwdrivers will do the job nicely. It might only be that you need to loosen off a couple and pull the track out. As you can see, this one's not quite secure yet, but by using these screws with the availability, you can actually make minor adjustments. Now here's the screw in close-up, and as you can see, it has a sort of washer element designed into it. Now, to secure the track in place then, as I showed, you can just move it around until you feel confident that it's in the right place with the gaps. And because none of it's secured, you don't have a problem with the joints because you just move the whole thing. And then with this little nifty electric battery operated screwdriver and these screws, it's as simple as that. And all I do is put 2 per track into the board. Hopefully I can keep my hands out of the way. And the job's a good one, really. It is quite simple. And the screws are low enough so that KD couplings and the like do not touch them. So they are nice and low. And that is how I secure all the track down. And as you can see here, the wires just tuck out of the way and go through a hole. As the levels build up, the wires will just be secured to the rod and then down through the holes. Easy. Well, both of those tracks are installed and they seem fine. I've ran this Mark III coach up and down. It doesn't derail or anything. It all sort of works. But of course, I did check all the levels in accordance with Lee's spreadsheet and adjusted these accordingly, so everything seems fine. But of course that actually mean that it can work. So what I've actually done is taken this set of cables from the outside track, hooked them up, bit of a botch, into this terminal block to power up the track, and now we really need to send a train up it before we cover it forever with the next level of the Helix. So the proof of the pudding, as usual, is in the eating. So let's stick a train on it and see if reasonably slowly a train can climb up this, what was it, 1 in 42 helix. Well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. And the length of this train is clearly quite substantial. But I do have a kill switch. So here it is on the helix, completely stopped. So will it pull power and move away okay? Yes. So clearly this gradient is not too steep for it. Of course, testing is always a worrying time, but at the end of the day, if we don't test and we just carry on regardless and hope the whole thing works, it will be somewhat naive. But anyway, that works okay. The power gets to all the tracks and everything else. The HST unit isn't a particularly powerful unit, but it's pulling what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 7 coaches and of course the dummy car at the back. So it's a fair old unit, and it climbs up here no problems whatsoever. So I'm sure the rest of my diesel fleet will manage this quite easily. Right, a couple of other tools I need to show you. Now this little beast is a digital spirit level, and if I put it on here, we should be reading about 2.381 according to with Lee's thing. And what have we got? 2.3. This is a tiny amounts. But having one of these little digital spirit level will keep you on the right track, and it also acts as an ordinary spirit level for obviously making sure that you are across the tracks, and you've got obviously the ordinary bubble type affair to make sure you're right. But it's not necessarily essential, but if things go wrong, at least you can find where they went wrong. But so useful little bit of kit if you're going to build a helix. I'm sure this hasn't escaped you that there are lots of nuts and washers and things to go on top of these rods. So that leaves you with a shocking dilemma that to put the next platform in place and the 2 support pieces on top, you need, underneath this, you need a nut. And one on the other side. And then on top of the nut, you need a washer. And then on top of the washer goes the assembly, and then on top of it goes a washer and a nut. How long is this going to take to build this helix, knowing how long these things are? Well, you'll be pleased to know that there's something called a swift nut, and you can attach a drill to it. And here's how it works. Rest assured, without one of these little devices, this would become an absolute nightmare. So on go the washers. And on go the plates. And the outside, the inside, and as you'd expect, 2 more washers, and so on. One word of warning before you cover it up: obviously make sure the track is clean and run your fingers across the tops of the joins between the rails. Twice I fitted this today and found a rail above the fish plate, you know, where the flat bottom area didn't go into the fish plate, but it seems to be okay, and it isn't. So you really have to go back and check not time and time again, but just make sure that it's dead right. So once you've finished, then go around and do a sort of a sanity check and make sure it's good. Right, I don't really need to sit here now and show you how to build the other 3.5 levels, so I'll see you in a bit. Now you rejoin me halfway through day 3 and the 4 complete loops are on, and I've just got the last 3/4 of the segments to do, which is 6 out of 8 because it ends just over there, and I've just popped these in place. I've sorted out the heights by adjusting the nuts as usual, so I'll just go through and show you how I glue them down and clamp them, and then just lay the last bit of track. Now, as I mentioned, I use Gorilla Glue, and all I do is I put one streak on one side of the platform and one on the other, and should you make a mistake, it doesn't come apart easily, let's say. Then pop in the platform, and then I pop in the next one, and then I clamp them both. It doesn't take much Gorilla Glue, but it is a decent commodity. Now I have a couple of odd curves left, so I use those to protect my foam from the clamps themselves. And then with the clamps, and rest assured you need a lot of clamps, then the glue only takes between 15 and 20 minutes to go off. So if you've got some decent neighbours, let's say, have a ask around, or your friends or whatever, and try to get as many clamps as you can, because it is certainly worth doing it, sort of one complete circuit at a time. And that is all there is to it. So I shall now carry on around the circuit and finish it off. As I said, you can't have too many clamps. So the glue has gone off. It's about 30, 35, 40 minutes later, and I've started to fit the track, and these are the droppers that go down into the central area, and they'll all be routed down here. But what I do is I put all the track together before I secure it down, because that way you can avoid any sort of dog legs or whatever by putting it down as a oneer. And as I mentioned, I never use used fish plates. So even if you're going to recycle track, please use new fish plates. It's not too crucial here actually, because this is the top level, so this piece here can be reasonably easily serviced at the moment, which we go into the testing phase next. But of course, once I built on top of it, that will be a little different. Now you've installed the circuit of track as a one. They're all joined up, there are no gaps, everything's good to go, and it's in position, and that's when you start screwing down. And all I do with those screws that I mentioned earlier, and this beautiful little screwdriver, is pop them in position. This really is a doddle. And just work your way around, and it's going to be right because you've already checked the whole route. So I'll finish this one and the next one, and then we'll check the heights. Now the truth of it is I'm a 1/4 of an inch out. It should be 33 3/4, and it isn't. I'm at 34 inches. Hey, we can cope with that. So Helix 2 is now complete, and it's a sturdy old arrangement. I'm very pleased with the way it's turned out. It's taken me 3 days from start to finish, and it's now day 3, and it's 20 to 5. But half a day of that is concerned really with the film and the editing. So really, it's a 2.5 day job. But please bear in mind that this isn't the first one I've built, so I knew what was sort of going on in the first place. If you're contemplating building one of these, please think about the price, because the track is expensive. I was fortunate in this case because I did buy a lot of track at cut down prices, and whilst I'm on the subject of track, I must thank Andrew Hope, because he's got an eBay page and I cleaned him out of third radius curve, because this stuff is all brand new. So Andrew, thank you very much. And whilst I'm thinking about thanks, let's say, obviously James at DCC Train Automation, because he's helped me a great deal with the provision of these helixes, and let's not lose sight of Lee, because Lee is the brains behind the whole construction really. And now hopefully that height, I know I lost 1/4 of an inch, but I'm sure I can wind this down a shade if it's that crucial, but I can take those tracks and move them over into the riverboard. Also I'd like to thank, and that's my friend Ed, because he gave me all the info on the S-curves. I knew there were problems with S-curves, but he kind of put me straight on all that kind of thing. Now, tools. One thing I didn't mention was a pair of 13mm spanners you'd need for all the nuts and bolts, and I did mention this sexy battery operated screwdriver chargeable by USB, the Swift nut, and of course the digital spirit level. And these 3 are in the show more tab should you be interested in building one of these beasts of your own. It is quite straightforward, but I cannot emphasize enough that when you put the tracks together, if you put a sleeper underneath the top of the track and you don't run your fingers over it, then you are in big trouble, because how you're going to get down to the 4th layer or whatever and sort it out. So check and check again. You've got to get this right. The track underneath these levels has got to be absolutely perfect. As for the alignments, I mean, you can always adjust them. It's only a couple of spanners to get in there to move the boards around, or indeed to change the inclines. But you're not going to be able to get to that track and sort out, you know, things like fish plates. If you've got a dead spot, you can always get in there and solder on another couple of droppers. That's, you know, no real big shakes. It's a little bit cramped, but you know, it's quite achievable. But there we go. Right, I think that really wraps this one up. So, as I'd like to say as usual, I'll see you in 2 weeks' time, and I've got a lovely layout to show you in 2 weeks' time. It really is one of the it's one of the top 5 layouts in the country. So I want to take you and show you that. So I'd like to thank the patrons as usual, and if you'd like to come and help me support the channel, then please hit the button. And if you're not a subscriber, there's the button for that. And of course, subscription is free. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. In the meantime, a video here and here. Take care. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.